Hello, everyone. Welcome to our program, Slavery in America, with a focus on the Piper family. My name is Melissa Dalton, and I am the Public Outreach Coordinator for the Greene County Record Center and Archives, and I'll be walking us through the program today. But before we actually get into our program, let's talk a little bit about our institution. The Greene County Archives was founded in 1996, and the Greene County Archives actually holds the historical records for the county. So any department that creates a record that they deem historical is going to be held by our facility. So these types of records could include things like probate records, which would be estates, wills, marriage, adoption, birth and death records. It could be clerk of court records, which would be divorce, early naturalizations, criminal disputes, criminal cases, and civil disputes. It could be tax records, deeds and mortgages. It could be survey records, maps. There's a bunch of different types of records that you might use when you come into our facility. And the photograph you see here is of our reading room in the top left-hand corner. And this is where you will come to do research. Now, Greene County's records actually date back to 1803. So why is that? Greene County was established in 1803, the same year as Ohio. And when Greene County was originally established, it actually went all the way up to Lake Erie. And it wasn't until 1819 that it got its current borders. Now you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, this is what we call our stats. And this is where the majority of our records are held. So you'll notice here that most of the records are in boxes, which means they're individually filed papers within folders. And there's a few reasons that the stacks, these are not open to the public. It's not accessible to the public. So there's a few reasons for this. It could be that the records, maybe they're starting to deteriorate. Paper might be becoming brittle. Maybe there's tears. We want to give it more protection and keep it in the back so maybe it's not handled as frequently. And like I said, these are mostly boxes, and so if we were to allow the general public to come back and just go through the boxes, there's a potential that papers could potentially go missing, get misfiled, and we don't want that to happen. And so when you come in, like I said, you'll be usually utilizing our reading room. Now today we're going to be using resources. So today we're going to be using primary and secondary resources to learn about slavery in America, and particularly the Piper family. So what is a primary resource? Somebody raise your hand and say what a primary resource is. So a primary resource, they are the original document or an object that was created at the time of the event. So this would be somebody who maybe has firsthand experience. So what are some examples of a primary resource? So primary resources can be a number of things: photographs, maps, sound recordings, diaries, letters, birth certificates. Most of the records that I talked about when on the previous slide, those are all primary resources. Now, so what is a secondary resource? A secondary resource, those are the interpretation of event after the fact. So this is created by somebody who does not have firsthand experience. So what would be some examples of a secondary resource? Examples include things like textbooks, encyclopedias. So you could also think of Wikipedia, the internet, any kind of Google search, newspapers and magazines. Those are usually considered secondary resources. They can be considered primary depending on the situation. We're going to be using a number of resources today to learn about the Pipers. But before we get into that, let's learn a little bit about slavery.
A slave was someone who could be forced to work from the age of 8, 6, 4 even. Long hours at tasks that someone else decided. A slave was a person who had no right to a vacation. A slave was a person who had no rights to wages. A slave could have no property. A slave could not marry.
By the late 18th century,
Now that was just a really short video clip, but it kind of gives you a good idea of what it was like to be a slave. So after listening to that clip, I want you guys to look at this photograph. Let's examine this photograph. What do you notice in this photograph? And thinking about that clip, what do you think that a life as a slave would have been like? So this photograph, you see things like it looks like a small house, maybe a shack, likely dirt floors. The clothing is ragged, so it's possible these are hand-me-downs. They probably wear these all day in the fields, and they're going to have to make any repairs on these themselves. Some people are wearing shoes, some aren't, and likely if you had shoes, they were probably hand-me-down. So really, honestly, and there are a lot of people in one space, so it looks like a lot of people probably living in this house. So it's a small space. So really, they were only given the bare minimum to survive. So clothing, food, and shelter were minimum. Many times they had to fend for themselves. So maybe they had to fish for added protein in their diet, grow small gardens, and this was all after working long hours in the field. And this could be anywhere from 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And today we're actually going to learn about a unique slave family from Louisiana who were freed by their slave owner, and they came here and settled in Greene County. So let's actually learn a little bit about them. So you guys all have a packet of information in front of you. And I want you guys to look at that first page. And what you're going to see is a census record. Does anyone know what is a census record? Someone raise your hand. A census is a record that is a procedure for systematically acquiring and recording information about a particular population. So in this case, it's the United States population. Census records determine the number of seats a state has in the House of Representatives, as well as how to distribute federal funds to local communities. So the census record is really important. And you probably actually have heard a lot of people talk about the census, the 2020 census, and completing that, because it does have ramifications for your local community when you talk about the funding. So here we're going to actually be looking at the census record for Catahoula Parish, Louisiana. Does anyone know what the difference between a parish and a township are, or a county? So a parish is an ecclesiastical term, so it revolves around the church, and it's an administrative district of the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's usually centered around one church, and it was administered by a priest. So Louisiana was originally a part of the church. So it was officially Roman Catholic under both French and Spanish rule. Now, today, it's really just the equivalent of a county. So it's one of those terms that has stuck in Louisiana, and it's particular to Louisiana. The boundaries dividing the territories generally coincided with the church parishes too. And it was in 1807, the territorial legislature officially adopted that term. And through each change, though, Louisiana kept with her history and never deviated from using that term. So it's still how categorize their counties today. So let's look at this census record. So you guys have a list of questions in front of you. So let's think about this. What do you think this is? I mean, we know that it says it's a census record. And what is it actually telling you? What are we going to be able to learn from this census record? So take a few minutes and write down what you see for Philip Piper. So this record tells us that Philip is 50 years old, he's white, and he's a planter. He had real estate valued at $16,000 and a personal estate of $20,000. And this is the 1860 census record. Now let's look at the 1860 slave schedule. Does anyone know what is a slave schedule? So a slave schedule was used in 1850 and 1860 censuses. It was a way to account for the number of slaves an owner had during the time of the census. Most do not include names, but age, sex, and color or race were typically notated. So by looking at this slave schedule, what can we learn? This slave schedule tells us a few things. Philip owned 16 slaves. You can see that it's outlined there in red. There were 8 male and 8 female. The oldest was 52-year-old female, and the youngest was a 2-month-old male. Now let's look at this deed record. This is a deed record, volume 37, page 554 through 555. So what is this record telling you? And what can we gather about the family? But maybe before we ask that question, maybe we should ask, does anyone know what is a deed record? What does it actually tell you? So a deed is any legal instrument in writing which passes, affirms, or confirms an interest, right, or property in that is signed, attested, delivered, and in some jurisdictions sealed. So as such, the slaves of Philip Piper were his property, which is why their freedom papers are in a deed record. So that's what we're looking at here. This is actually a freedom paper. So let's actually read through this. This says that Philip Piper is freeing Nellie and her children. Nellie Piper and her children. And they were going to be settling in Greene County, Ohio. In addition to that, they were paying $1,000 for their freedom. Now, Nellie actually had a relationship with Philip. He was her slave owner, and they had actually had several children together. And this actually wasn't that uncommon during this time. Now, you'll also notice as you read through this that there is the term mulatto listed. Does anyone know what that term means? What's the equivalent today? Mulatto was a term used to describe a person who was of mixed race, so biracial. And it's not a term we use today. It's only used in its historical context. And also, as you go through here, you're going to notice that there's a lot of description about Nellie and her children. So what are some reasons that this information is included in this record? These descriptions acted as forms of identification. So ultimately, a freedom paper was a way to identify the person carrying that paper. So this would be a form that Nellie would carry with her at all times, or her children would carry with them, so that if they were stopped and asked to present their papers, they could show somebody that, yes, in fact, they were free. And by reading the description, the person would know that this is them. Now, unfortunately, just because you had a freedom paper did not guarantee that you would not be taken into custody or that you would not be sold back into slavery. But it was a way to hopefully circumvent that from happening. There were many laws called the Black Codes, or Black Laws, that were enacted to reduce the influence of freed blacks on the slave population. These laws were passed in the southern states, but many northern states enacted similar laws, which did not allow freed blacks to vote, own guns, assemble, testify in court, and in some cases even learn how to read or write. And these laws were a way for the slave owners and ultimately white society to protect their way of life. Now, even though Ohio's Constitution made slavery illegal, it did not mean that freed slaves or former slaves were treated as equals. In 1804, Ohio passed a series of laws they called the Black Laws. These required that all blacks and mulattoes, remember, this is historical context here, had to furnish certificates of freedom from a court in the United States before they could settle in Ohio. All black residents had to register with their names and the names of their children and pay a fee. And this equaled roughly 12 cents a person to begin with. Additionally, it was a punishable offense to employ a black person who could not present a certificate of freedom. And then in 1807, these laws were were actually expanded. And now they had to find at least two people who would guarantee a surety, so a bond, of $500 for the African Americans' good behavior. $500 at this time is close to $8,000 today, if not more. And they were still limited on their rights, so they still weren't able to marry. They weren't able to marry somebody who was white. They couldn't own guns, and all of those other rights that we listed earlier. Those were still not open to them. So Nellie and her children, and Philip ultimately, came from Louisiana to Greene County, Ohio. That was over 800 miles. Actually, about 874 miles is how far they traveled. So let's look at this timeline to answer question number 3 on your list. So by examining the secondary resource, which is a timeline that was created by our office, let's find the clue that discusses why the family would settle in Greene County, Ohio. So looking at this timeline, can you determine what the Piper children did once they settled in the county? So let's look at question 3 first. So Ohio did prohibit slavery, so that was one reason that they might have settled in Ohio. However, Greene County was a place that had a large and strong abolitionist community and movement. So it was a more welcoming environment. But they also had cheap and fertile farmland. So not only were your freed blacks welcome to the community, they were also able to own land for themselves. And the Pipers, much like many others, settled in Greene County around Wilberforce University for that very reason. Another reason they settled here was because of the opportunities offered by Wilberforce University. Wilberforce was established as an institution for freed blacks, including the slave children of Southern plantation owners, to gain in a higher education. They were able to attend university, which was something uncommon for that time. In early 1856, the Methodist Episcopal Church purchased the property for Wilberforce University at Toowoomba Springs near Xenia, Ohio. The university ended up closing for a year in 1862 due to the Civil War, but in March 1863, Bishop Daniel Payne of the African Methodist Episcopal Church negotiated to purchase the university's facilities. Payne, who was a member of the original 1856 corporation, secured the cooperation of John G. Mitchell, who was the principal of the Eastern District Public School of Cincinnati, and James Shorter, who was the pastor of the AME Church in Zanesville, Ohio. The property was then turned over to them as the agents of the church, and it was incorporated in July 1863. Then in 1887, the state of Ohio began to fund the university by establishing a combined normal and industrial department. And this department actually later became Central State University. Also from Wilberforce spawned another institution, Payne Theological Seminary, which was founded in 1891 as an outgrowth of the theological department. Now, question 4. Now, if we're looking at the timeline again, let's find clues that discuss where Nellie and Philip got married. And why did they have to get married in this place? So take a few moments to review the timeline. Philip and Nellie Piper traveled to Pennsylvania to get married. Like we learned with the Black laws, it was illegal for a biracial couple to get married in Ohio, so they had to travel to a state that allowed it, which was Pennsylvania was one of the only ones at the time. It was legal in Pennsylvania. However, there was another reason. Another reason that Philip and Nellie traveled to get married was because Daniel Payne, which we discussed in one of the previous slides, who was, again, remember, a founder of Wilberforce University, he told Philip and Nellie that if they wanted to remain within the community, they had to get legally married. So a year after settling, Philip and Nellie did get married. And remember, this is pretty unusual for the occurrence for a slave owner to marry his slave mistress, basically. But unlike many slave owners who considered their slaves to simply be property and not human beings, Philip actually loved Nellie. And he renounced his identity as a slave owner and actually sold his property or sold his slaves and moved to Ohio with her and their children. So this was a pretty unique story. So Philip and Nellie and their children actually lived here in Greene County within that community for a long time. They got here, like I said, in the 1860s. And we're going to actually look at another record. So question 5, we're going to be looking at, this is a death register of deaths. Have any of you ever examined a death certificate before? This one is different than what you would see today. Most of them are actually today you're going to have an actual certificate for each individual person, which will give a detail about who they were, descriptions about them, demographics, and then their cause of death. Whereas a registered death is going to have a date, their names, place of death, age, race, cause of death, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of people entered on one page, as you can see by looking at this one. So let's find Philip Piper on this. So when did he die? Where did he die? How old was he? And what was his cause of death? And is there anything that you notice that's interesting about this death record? Philip Piper died on November 1st, 1879, in Xenia Township when he was 74 years old. Now let's look at the next page. Do you notice, though, before we move on, what do they list under the column color? They actually list Philip Piper as black. This is somewhat interesting, and a little ironic, as he was a former slave owner, and his children, who were previously slaves, were actually inheriting his entire estate. So we think probably what happened was when Nellie or his children, whoever actually were the ones who went in to register his death, that they just made an assumption that he was black. So here we see where the star is. That's for his record. So they do list him as being married, that he was a farmer by occupation when they moved here to Greene County, and he died of heart disease. Looking at those diseases, because they do list it as disease, what caused the death, are there any that stand out to you that maybe you're not familiar with? So you probably see consumption, which is tuberculosis. You might see cholera, which is a bacterial infection of the intestines that's caused by contaminated water. Old age, I think we can all guess what that means. Dropsy is a form of edema, so that means you're retaining a lot of water. So depending on how that water is retained, it can cause a lot of issues. Rheumatism, which is a disease of joints and muscles. Congestive lungs, that could be basically where the air sacs and blood vessels fill with blood due to all kinds of different other diseases. You'll see kidney disease, and you also see broken leg. Likely he had a broken leg that was infected and ultimately caused their death. I would like you guys to look at this Piper family tree. Let's dig a little deeper and learn what Nellie and Philip's first son, let's learn a little bit about Silas. So I want you guys to look at the census record that you have, the 1880 Greene County Census Record. What can you gather about the opportunities Silas and Ella Piper had after the Civil War? So Ella, you'll notice here on the Piper family tree, is Silas's wife. So here we have June 1880 in Greene County. So this is the census record. And we've highlighted his name here, and Ella. Silas and Ella both had advanced employment opportunities. Silas was a former slave, and he is now listed as a grocer, meaning he maybe owned his own grocery store in Xenia. His wife, Ella, who was born in North Carolina, and we believe she was also a slave at one point, was a school teacher, and she likely taught African American children. This is actually pretty impressive for two former slaves, as many rights and liberties were restricted for them. Additionally, they both were in their early 20s at this time, which means they were probably pretty ambitious, and they were trying to make a better life for themselves and their family. You can see that Ella, she has an opportunity to teach children, and Silas has the opportunity to own something for himself. And as slaves, neither of those would have been an option otherwise. Silas was actually a graduate from Wilberforce University. And we just wanted you guys to look at this just to show that just because they were former slaves didn't mean that they didn't make a life for themselves. So they went to college, they gained an education here at Wilberforce that they wouldn't have had that opportunity otherwise. So it's important to note this. Now that you know more about the Pipers and their family and Nellie, I want you guys to write a firsthand narrative. So take a moment and read Nellie's obituary. Think about her life experiences. Think about what thoughts and feelings she might have had. What societal changes did she witness in her lifetime? So take a few moments and write a narrative. Be creative. We also wanted to show you, this is Philip and Nellie Piper's tombstone. They're buried in Massey's Creek Cemetery in Cedarville, Ohio. So Philip Piper, it's actually one headstone, and Philip Piper is listed on the front, and then Nellie's name is on the back. So they were buried together, and some of their children are buried beside them as well. This is a really extraordinary story, and it happened right here in Greene County. That's the one thing that's really great about Greene County, is that we have a lot of these types of stories because of the roots of Wilberforce University. We appreciate you taking the time to learn about slavery in America, in particular, the Pipers. And if you would like to learn more about any of these topics or about any of our other programming, we hope that you will visit our website. We have a lot of student resources and educational resources there. We also have a blog post that we do weekly, which highlights prominent peoples in Greene County, places, events, different stories that we find. So there's a lot of really small or really interesting blogs out there. We also have an online presence with Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And also, if you're interested in learning more and seeing more emancipation records, we do have those available on our Flickr page. So we hope you've enjoyed the program today, and have a great afternoon.